Steve is a senior vice president at the Maersk Lines, which is really the world's biggest container shipping company. And he's in that very area, international shipping. Previously, in the U.S. Marine Management, he's been in the Naval Studies Board, a past member of the Chief of Naval Operations, on the executive panel, on the Marine panel. Bill Doyle is our second speaker, and he's the master of the ports in Maryland. He was appointed by the Governor Hogan just under 2 years ago. He previously served as a federal maritime commissioner under President Obama, and then he was executive director of the Dredging Contractors of America, a trade association. He's a graduate of the Massachusetts Maritime Academy. He served 10 years on ships as a merchant marine officer, but he's also been a graduate. He's also a graduate of the Widener University School of Law. The Port of Baltimore, which he oversees, has the biggest volume of cars, light trucks, farm equipment, and heavy-duty construction equipment of any port, and it's expanding.
Thank you all for joining us here this evening. I want to start with the obligatory disclaimer that what I'm about to say are my opinions alone and do not represent in any way the positions or policies of my employer. This is particularly important to say since Chatham House rules do not apply. If they did, you'd really get an earful, but they don't, so it's just me talking. So when I think about the current state, or somewhat dismal state, as some would say, in a situation on supply chains, I am reminded of the motivational words of a great leader faced with similar trying circumstances. He said, quote, "I think we have to go all out. I think this situation absolutely requires a really futile and stupid gesture on somebody's part." When it comes to supply chain situation, the government has fully accepted this line of thinking, and in fact, they have embraced it as their strategy. Those stirring words were, of course, uttered by Eric Otter Stratton, Delta Fraternity Rush chairman in Animal House. So that pretty much describes what I see going on. Lots of hamster wheel stuff because something needs to be done, with a primary focus of that activity being what's going on in voters' heads, not what's happening in the economy. So let me start with some observations or truisms when it comes to supply chains, at least as I see things. Number one, we are not now and can never be totally sufficient, self-sufficient in anything and still maintain the standard of living we have now. We have to trade. Two, you can't de-risk a supply chain. All you can do is move the risk around or hide it. You can't eliminate it. I spent enough time on that the last time. Three, the inflation we see today is not caused by shipping companies or oil companies, no matter how much politicians would like that to be true. Excess demand and not enough stuff to satisfy it are the culprits. Four, both excess demand and not enough stuff, more often than not, are the result of poor government policy, however much politicians might wish that that was not true. Things we'll explore a little later. By the way, the U.S. Energy Information Administration just released its forecast for wholesale electricity prices over the summer, which are expected to double. Electrons are not delivered in a container, so that's not our fault. But it will affect you in both what you pay directly and also indirectly, since electricity is an input into everything you buy. Yes, it's part of the supply chain, which in turn needs to be covered by prices going up. If there's any consolation, the energy grid, suffering from years of underinvestment, is not expected to handle the summer load well, with lots of grid failures and power outages in many parts of the country. Since you don't pay for electrons the power company can't deliver, that will be a break in your energy bill. So there's a silver lining. Although I have no doubt power companies are working feverishly to close that loophole right now. As a note, if we want to begin to address the sad state of our electrical grid, we cannot do it without buying stuff from China, and a lot of it, who is the major, or in some cases only, source of supply for critical components needed to do so. As an extension of muddled policy, principles have a cost. High-minded ideals and making the world a better place by sticking to them will be expensive. Morals on the cheap don't work. The range of examples here is wide and apply to oil and climate change, human rights in China and Saudi Arabia, sanctions on Russia, to name a few. All examples of where we want to stand on principles, but then are shocked when prices here go up as a result. And a lot more on this in a minute. And lastly, global trade systems, which are what supply chains are, enormously complex, self-organizing, adaptive systems. Treating them as if they are independent stovepipes, where you can act in one area without seeing results in another unrelated area, is a fundamental failure to understand what it is we're dealing with. Nothing is unrelated to anything. And as a corollary, something you've heard before, nothing is made somewhere, everything is made everywhere, the made-in label is meaningless. Another thing I'll mention off the top is the term supply chain, which implies a linear process where a break in any link causes a failure in a chain, an outmoded way of thinking. A really resilient supply architecture is a nonlinear supply web with multiple supply nodes at every step, with the ability to move around the web seamlessly to bypass congestion or disruption. Now, to start, there is no doubt the world is a little messy right now, but let's be clear, this has happened before, and nothing here is unprecedented or unpredicted. From an overall system-level look, in fact, returning to a theme I and others have mentioned before, day by day, the current situation looks increasingly like that in the run-up to and early parts of World War I. The eminent historian Nick Lambert's excellent book, The Warlords and the Gallipoli Disaster, is a really good study on this, and I recommend that book to anyone who thinks today's breakdown of mechanics of globalization is in any way unique. It is an excellent primer on the state of globalization then and how very much it mirrors where we are today. As a brief example, back then the British had a critical wheat problem. The Black Sea was blockaded, sound familiar? Which was a cost problem, not an availability problem, and heading towards causing social unrest, just like today in oil. They dealt with it by manipulating the market through expectations on future wheat prices. This is really what SPR releases do, a classic example of a useless action designed only to work in the heads of voters. There is no shortage of crude oil here, and SPR releases will either be exported or simply displace other crude we would have imported. We do have a very robust two-way trade in crude, both exporting and importing it. Refineries here are running flat out, so more crude but no place to cook it will not help. Last time I looked, a week or two ago, gasoline stocks were down to a 2-day supply nationally. In other words, a supply constriction. COVID is over and we're hitting the road, and I certainly felt it driving up here from Norfolk. In other words, high demand, the classic formula for increased prices. Refining capacity is down significantly from its peak in 2020, and government policy that discouraged investment in the oil and gas industry in general has a lot to do with that. Add to that the global impacts of boycotting Russian oil. We don't use much here, but it is a global market. China, at the same time, is cutting their export quotas for refined products, causing Asian buyers to look to the Middle East, which is struggling to supply Europe, and the ripple effects of a global fungible market come home to roost. In fact, here in the U.S., we are screaming about high prices, bargain basement, of course, compared to Europe, but still. Diesel and gasoline exports to Latin America, Brazil and Mexico being in the lead, are up 27% last year, according to this month's API data, and no slowdown in sight. Why? The U.S. pressured everyone to boycott Russian oil. That does not mean that demand goes away. It just gets satisfied some other way. Latin America formerly got a lot of oil from Europe, now not available due to sanctions, so they are on the hunt for other supplies, including in the U.S. Oil goes to the highest bidder, hence the exports. A perfectly predictable result of sanctions, standing on principle. So either export restrictions need to go in, a remarkably bad idea, likely at best to backfire here, cause even worse havoc in international energy markets, actually make things worse here and abroad, and as one-way globalization breaks, more on that in a minute, or prices have to rise more to tamp down demand in all markets, not just here. One other thing on export restrictions. That means the U.S. is telling everyone to stand on principles and boycott Russian oil. Just don't let it cause any pain here. Hypocrisy is not a good international relations strategy, it seems to me. The news here is all about oil, but the same thing is happening in the coal markets. Europe used to source about 70% of their imports of thermal coal from Russia, now sanctioned. So the same issues are happening in the global coal market. Russia is offering bargain basement prices for coal, China is happily buying it all up, displacing imports they used to get from South Africa, and on we go. And as a quick note, invoking the Defense Production Act, something worthy of Otter's quote for sure, will not help. And in general, I think we are way past where invoking a DPA for non-defense related issues is a good thing, and is heading towards dangerous territory in the government's propensity to interfere in markets. Remember, if everything is national security, then nothing is national security. It's just the government thinking they know better than everyone else. This also brings up another point often missed in the "it's Russia's fault" rhetoric. And at the risk of pissing some people off, and not the first time I've done that for sure, when pointing fingers at where the chaos in the oil market is coming from, I would point out Russia is not refusing to sell oil to anyone, or at least it didn't start that way. No constraint on supply from them. The West is refusing to buy it. Just under a third of Russian refining capacity has been idled due to Western sanctions, and in April, Rosneft announced it would no longer export diesel as a result. Consequently, market exports estimate 1.3 million barrels per day from Russia will remain offline for the rest of the year, and Russian production is likely to stay down given its dependence on technology it no longer has access to due to sanctions for a long time. And these are choices the West made. In other words, we did this to ourselves. Russia did not do it to us when it comes to energy, and we are likely to feel the consequences for some time to come. Don't get me wrong, I am not opposed to Russian sanctions, and in fact strongly believe a robust response is essential. I just have serious doubts about the effectiveness of the sanctions as currently implemented and the West's stomach for enduring the pain they are causing here. I am already seeing cracks, especially in the U.S., the aforementioned export restrictions being a serious one. The market for oil, as is for many things, complex and global. Hard to believe anyone thought that the U.S. pressing Europeans to boycott Russian oil would not find its way to prices here. Couple that with underinvestment in traditional energy as we look to renewables without a clean transition strategy, and our principles are hitting us squarely in the pocketbook, and we do not like it one bit. As an example of the whipsaw, the EU is moving to ban insuring Russian oil cargoes, which the U.S. opposes. Another crack, since it will exacerbate the fuel cost problem. Maybe our principles have a limit, and it seems $5 a gallon is approaching it. And if we think we're sending a message to China with all this, I might be in the minority on this, but I'm thinking China is not getting the same message we think we're sending. We have been through all this before, and we got it seriously wrong then with dire consequences, which is why we need to pay attention to history. Globalization is not inevitable. It is not some immutable force of nature. Globalization is also not reversible. And the very notion of deglobalization being a thing is dangerous. Globalization is, however, breakable. And the last time globalization broke, it was a violent affair that took generations to recover from, remembering that at the demise of the last stage of globalization, the world was every bit as integrated with all the same types of supply chain dependencies and vulnerabilities as we have now. What kinds of things can break globalization? Tariffs, calls to bring supply chains back home, friendshoring, which is dangerously close to protectionism and discriminates against developing economies, export restrictions, which is a fancy name for protectionist hoarding, and currency wars, or in today's environment, reverse currency wars, to name a few, all of which are happening now. In surveying the types of things that are being done in the name of addressing the problem, a good example is the recent executive orders on solar panels and other renewable energy technologies. First, there is no question the U.S. solar panel industry is in total disarray. There is also no doubt the root of that disarray are actions taken by the government back at the beginning of the year in an effort to protect the infant solar panel industry and stand on principles regarding human rights in China. But in practice, it just totally fouled it up. How to destroy an industry in one easy step. In reality, the executive order attempts to undo the damage the government did earlier, although it remains to be seen how effective it will be, as central parts of the problem were just kicked down the road with no kidding, you can count on this roadmap to guide investment. Other aspects of the executive order all require Congress to authorize and appropriate money. Maybe I'll have a beer with Otter while I wait and see how this works out, and I'm not holding my breath. By the way, much like semiconductors, we're still talking about assembly of solar panels, not true manufacturing. Most of the stuff, including 100% of the critical stuff it takes to make a solar panel, will still be imported, mostly from China. And we spent a lot of time on this last time we were together. The recent emergency flights to import baby fruit from Asia does the same thing, addressing a failure in government policy that is in large measure responsible for the problem to begin with. They just don't tell you that in a press release. As another example, it does not do any good to partner with ports to increase gate operating hours if truckers don't show up to pick up the cargo because there are not enough of them. And what truckers are available are burning up all their allowable hours of work during regular hours. So a 24-hour gate, a government-led solution trumpeted with great fanfare by the administration, except the part about no one showing up, did not do any good. Something ports knew would happen because they had already tried it. In fact, currently, even during the day, LA is running at only about 53% gate utilization. About half the available gates are unused. Our real problem is in warehouse space to take the cargo to, where essentially there is no spare capacity at all. And again, labor shortages are rife all through the industry. To demonstrate the system nature of the overall problem and how addressing it in a stovepipe manner will fail, during the pandemic, roughly 1,000 mariners disappeared from the U.S. maritime industry. A lot of them switching to driving trucks. With a pandemic, or the worst aspects of it for seafarers anyway, over. About 1% of them came back to going to sea. Turns out driving a truck is pretty good by comparison. This is leaving a gaping hole in the labor shortage that already existed in the maritime industry. I recently read China is following the same legal gymnastics Russia did in the run-up to the Ukraine invasion, leaving many wondering if the time is nigh for a Taiwan special military operation. The ability of the U.S. to resupply that fight, a particular type of supply chain the government is responsible, dry cargo and fuel oil, is pretty low. If Chatham House rules applied today, I'd say it was non-existent. Perhaps the most critical supply chain overall for U.S. national security, and the one the government is 100% responsible for, is totally broken, with labor just one of several problems. But Chatham House rules don't apply, so I'm not saying that. One of the many things that all of a sudden has caught politicians' heads, and maybe a few in DOD, is the U.S. dependency on foreign sources of critical minerals like rare earths. This stuff is critically important to us and every other advanced economy, for everything from the magnet that is in every cell phone, to guidance systems and smart munitions, to advanced radar systems, to the electronics in your car. Basically all aspects of our daily lives and what we now consider essential and are a fundamental part of all supply chains. Hence, we have the American Critical Mineral Independence Act of 2021. We are dependent on China and to a lesser extent Russia for a lot of that stuff, and in some cases all of it. In June 2021, the administration released a, quote, first-of-a-kind supply chain assessment, unquote, and found that our over-reliance on foreign sources and adversarial nations for critical minerals and materials posed a national and economic security threat. And I can hear the gasp of surprise there. A great commentary I like on this topic is, quote, the U.S. is dependent at the 100% level for 17 critical strategic minerals, including graphite and rare earths, such as lanthanide for NVGs, lasers, rangefinders, radars, things like that, where our largest supplier is China, which is also our largest supplier for 6 of the 17 critical strategic minerals upon which we are totally dependent on imports. In terms of supply chain integrity, I'm not sure if military planning includes alternate sources for those critical materials should a conflict with China such as military planning anticipates actually occur. The author goes on to ask the question, at what point will China stop selling us the stuff we are using to build the bombs we are dropping on them? Antimony comes to mind here, highlighted in the most recent report, where we are almost totally reliant on China for critical input to munitions. I like that comment a lot because, first, the author was me. I said it at a presentation, shocking I know, on supply chains and national security. The best part is I gave that talk at the U.S. Naval Institute FC, a joint warfighting conference in Virginia Beach, Virginia, 14 May 2008, 14 years ago. First of its kind supply chain assessment? I don't think so. Both the Eisenhower School and NDU and the U.S. Geological Survey have been doing this for years. Startling finding on U.S. over-reliance on foreign sources of critical minerals and the impact on national security? No, not at all. We've known this for a very long time. Level of faith anything will actually come of the results of that study or the related act of Congress? Zero. Although it did, I believe, create another congressional subcommittee, which is always helpful. Maybe we'll get another study in a few years. That's about it. Something we need to remember as we finger wag at Germany for letting themselves get so over-reliant on Russian energy. We live in a really big glass house there, as we have done and continue to do the same thing, just different commodities. In fact, as I reread those remarks from a decade and a half ago, I am struck by just how applicable what I said then is still 100% relevant now. Only maybe worse if you update the statistics on things like critical mineral vulnerability. Those numbers I gave were 2008, and things haven't gotten better. I could just give that talk today, and you wouldn't realize I wrote it that long ago. Lots of similarities between now and then, too. We were just emerging from the financial crisis, and trade was a mess. Swine flu was a pandemic of the day, and gas was painfully expensive. And this is the great part. Then Energy Secretary Samuel Bodman said that insufficient oil production was driving rising crude prices, going on to say that oil production had not kept pace with growing demand. The oil guys were slacking. Where have we heard that lately? Crude collapsed later in the year, peaking in July at $147 a barrel, or adjusted for inflation, about $200 a barrel as compared to about $113 a barrel as of Friday. So it was a lot worse then than it is now, and finished the year at $32 a barrel. I can't remember if this was because the president wrote letters to the oil companies telling them to do something, but maybe somehow, apparently, we think that's going to work this time rather than letting the market take care of things. The only thing I would change from my comments from the last time then is the conclusion. Then I said I was optimistic we would get through this in good shape. I'm a little less sanguine now. Honestly, I feel like Phil Connor in Groundhog Day sitting in a car about to go over a cliff with an oversized rodent at the wheel. Kind of says it all in terms of supply chain policy. Lots of hamster wheel stuff that does not really fix anything. By the way, one difference between then and now is, of course, the war in Ukraine. China is always the boogeyman or country when it comes to dependency, but the same thing applies to Russia, where we are extraordinarily dependent on Russia for a lot of stuff that makes our life possible. And not talking oil here. A government focus on the supply chain mess is semiconductor chips. Talked about this the last time. Chips for America Act, as I said then, only really addresses bringing the assembly part of semiconductor chips manufacturing back to the U.S. and a very small part of it at that. We're still using imported materials as inputs to imported machines to produce made-in-America chips. In truth, this is optics, and there is nothing significant in terms of removing U.S. import reliance for semiconductor chips. This brings us to the Russia-Ukraine situation. The Ukraine makes more than 90% of high-grade neon used in gas-phase lasers used to make chips produced by U.S. semiconductor companies. The gas is a byproduct of Russian steel manufacturing, which is purified in the Ukraine, according to TechSet, a market research company. Russia also provides a third of the palladium metal used in sensors and memory products produced by U.S. companies, plus, of course, the less glamorous catalytic converters in your car. Russia is also a crucial source of C4F6, hexafluorocyclobutane, which U.S. suppliers buy and purify for advanced node logic etching devices and advanced lithography process chips for chip production. In the Chips for America Act, I don't see anything addressing this or any of the other hundreds of imports that goes into a very complex process for making a semiconductor. And that's because the people that wrote it don't understand what a complex global supply chain really is, instead just following Otter's advice. So how did we get to where we are? This breaks down to some key areas in my mind. Simply the structure of the world and the nature of markets. Marshall's scissors, supply and demand, are still fundamentally operative, and prices are the equilibrating mechanism. When supply and demand are out of balance, relative prices change to restore the market. But that means when supply outstrips demand, prices are high for a time. As has been said before, sometimes the best cure for high prices is high prices, which tamps down demand, increases incentives to suppliers, and moves the market back to equilibrium. As a report by the government found 2 years ago, our markets are competitive, and the high ocean freight rates have been determined by unprecedented consumer demand, primarily in the United States, that overwhelm the supply of vessel capacity congestion further constraining available capacity. Indeed, one of the most important functions prices play in a market economy is information. Interfering directly with market mechanisms, including something that plays such a critical role as prices, should be undertaken with extreme care, and government's history of getting that right is pretty sketchy. Markets are also undergoing some pretty fundamental shifts right now. Labor, touched on a moment ago, is a big one. This problem is everywhere, as anyone who has tried to get on a plane lately can attest. The airline industry, like the shipping industry, is critically short of labor to the point where airline schedules are pretty much a crapshoot in terms of getting them happening as published. And like maritime labor, these are high-skilled jobs with lots of training, in some cases years behind them. This will not be fixed overnight. So there are labor issues all up and down the supply chain, which is one reason shortages are somewhat uneven, but they will be around for a long time. In the end, this is what's going wrong in the tampon market. While there are import issues for materials such as cotton, it is fundamentally a labor problem, from manufacturing plants in the U.S. and Canada to warehousing to trucking. But we also have to be a little realistic here, too. The Wall Street Journal addressed this issue the other day, headlining, quote, "About 7% of tampons are out of stock nationwide," data show. Yet consumers in some parts of the country say their preferred brands are tough to find. The term preferred brand shows up everywhere in looking at this issue, not the term nothing on the shelves. At serious risk to my personal safety, let me opine, this does not sound like a national crisis. Major inconvenience, yes, but not a national crisis. It was also noted hoarding might be a factor here in response to a favorite brand not being available. But in the something has to be done category, politicians write letters to CEOs making a big public splash in doing so, demanding the favorite supply of tampons gets fixed. So the political types did something, and I'm sure it was helpful. It probably never occurred to those CEOs to ramp up supply before they got that letter. I'm wondering if those CEOs are comparing notes with the CEOs of the oil companies and the letters they got to see if they were form letters. We met the consumer side of what's going on here in my last talk as a bullwhip effect, and it is operative and in full vigor all over the place. Radical, sudden changes in consumer behavior at the end of the whip reverberate back through the supply chain. Take peanut butter. So there is an outbreak of salmonella at peanut suppliers for some Jif plants. This causes Jif to be in short supply for a time. Consumers, seeing less peanut butter on the shelves than they are used to, think there must be a shortage of peanut butter, even though it was initially only in one brand, and panic buy all the peanut butter they can carry, creating a shortage where none existed. Archaeologists 200 years from now will be unearthing basements stocked to the rafters with peanut butter, wondering, what the hell were these people thinking? But let's return to the labor market for a second. My view, these are not simple labor shortages. There's way more to it than that. The relationship, the contract between society and the concept of work is being rewritten. The rules are still being worked out on the fly. The consequences will alter much about how society organizes itself, and the fault lines in this tectonic shift are many, including a generational one. We will continue to see real impacts until that process settles down, and there is a general reset of expectations. In my view, this will take a long time. There is also friction as individual consumers want to rewrite their own individual contracts with the nature of work, but don't have much tolerance when everyone else is doing the same thing, causing disruptions. Next, the world and the countries that make it up are differently endowed with resources. These resources can be anything from arable and fertile land to critical minerals to energy to labor, both unskilled and skilled. The way we deal with that is trade. All these places are going through the exact same internal dislocations as are happening in the U.S. with global impacts. This is, after all, a global system, not a pile of stovepipes. Government fool with a system at all of our peril. This, by the way, is where I find fault with the friendshoring notion. This means trading with economies that look a lot like us, with similar outlooks and objectives. But a lot of what we need does not come from places like that. So we either forego things that cannot be so sourced at massive loss in productivity or outright supply constriction, and if you think prices and availability are bad now, or we find a place high enough in the supply chain where we can get the mostly or completely finished product from an economy similar to ours and call it a day, ignoring what happens below that level. Trying to mandate or legislate around this fundamental structure of the environment will fail. And lastly, as mentioned, government policy. Much of what's going on in the world of supply is a result of government action. What can be done about it? First, in some respects, things are a little better already. Freight rates are coming down, demand growth is slowing, congestion is easing, big box inventories are rising, all things indicating the pressure is starting to ease a little bit. None related to anything the government did. That said, there will be bumps, and we are heading into peak season after all. Let's not forget that. Every time China locks down in its zero COVID regime, it is a massive disruption that will ripple around the world, growing in magnitude as it does. Black swans continue to feast on this environment, so a recently reopened baby food plant will flood and have to be closed again, prolonging the pain in that market. Consumers will continue to crack the bullwhip, and peanut butter plants will have salmonella outbreaks. Another truism, the planet and Mother Nature cut stupidity very little slack. So it's going to be an uneven ride out of this. Next, we need to dispense with a protectionist rhetoric. Bringing supply chains home, friendshoring, export restrictions, and the like, first will accomplish nothing in terms of national security. In fact, will make things worse, both in the immediate term and in the longer-term trajectory of the international political economy. Again, we have to pay attention to history. Global manufacturing cannot be made 100% domestic unless we want to turn our standard of living, including access to the types of things we find necessary to our daily lives, back about 200 years. What we need are broad webs of suppliers, globally resilient, and in a system that trades freely. We have to recognize that such a system will fully operationalized will be more expensive than what existed previously, and a transition will have some uneven effects on prices. But most importantly, and related to how I concluded the last time, we have to suck it up. The primary way this will get resolved is changes in consumer behavior and expectations, and it's going to hurt. There are times your favorite brand, from peanut butter to tampons, are not available, and it's not the end of the world or a national security crisis. Economists call what needs to happen demand destruction, but the more simple way to look at it is high prices have to tamp down how much stuff we buy, which includes, by the way, maybe a redefinition of what we consider essential or the range of choices we need. Interfering with that process only make things worse. One of the key things that has to get more expensive, unfortunately, is money itself. Policy the government is responsible for it, and must say I think they could have handled it a little bit more elegantly and certainly earlier to avoid what now surely will be an exceptionally painful process. And lastly, we have to stop expecting that riding on a high horse and chasing noble goals will be costless. It won't. Prices are only high if they differ markedly from what we expect them to be. If policies are put in place to achieve some lofty goal, consumers were provided an honest assessment of the cost, they would know what to expect and maybe not be so dismayed at quote-unquote high prices. Trying to deter Russia by boycotting oil will hurt. The transition to a clean energy future is not going to be cheap, period. Telling consumers otherwise does a disservice to both consumers and a goal of clean energy future. Having a clear transition strategy, where government could help, would go a long way to both mitigating the impact on prices and setting clear expectations of what those impacts will be. But I'm not hopeful there. A mostly meaningless strategy for clean energy supply chains is most certainly not a transition strategy. But saving the planet is worth the time to put together a plan, or at least that's my opinion. Lastly, let me return to my somewhat harsh "suck it up" comment. It is evident we as a consumer society have grown accustomed to having exactly what we want, preferred brand and lots of choices when we want it, and when it does not happen, it is treated as a national security issue. We talk a lot about resilience in supply chains, but what we don't talk about is resilience in consumer expectations, like the mentality here that existed 80 years ago. I wonder or worry if we can suck it up and adjust as they did then when faced with an existential threat, a global war. Let's be clear, what we are experiencing now does not remotely scratch the surface of the dislocation in our economy or the world trading system and a catastrophic pain it will cause from an actual shooting conflict with China of any severity, and it will last a very long time. Society's ability to suck it up and get through it is, in my mind, and based on what I see now, a real national security threat no one is talking about. I doubt anyone is gaming out the real impacts of a collapse of trade with China and the resulting collapse of the international system. But what will Walmart shelves look like then? What will the impacts on availability of medicine and medical care be? What will unemployment be, and what will your 401k look like, amongst hundreds of other variables? What will society's reaction to it all be? Can the government afford the massive assistance programs that will be necessary in addition to funding a war? Of course, if we don't get the supply chain fixed, the war will likely be short. Still, U.S. citizens are owed a blunt and realistic assessment of what that world will look like before we get there. And the government should have a plan, because writing letters won't cut it. I could go on forever here, but I'm way over my time limit, I'm sure. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to being invited back 14 years from now to deliver these exact same remarks.
I remember the oil embargo of the early 70s. As a matter of fact, the LNG import facility in Boston, Massachusetts was one of the original 4 or 5 that were built because of the oil embargo. That was an import facility. And then, of course, coal took off through the roof. Now, when you talk about the politics and you talk about, we talk about what has happened in energy policy, there's a reminder that everyone needs to understand. It was under Gerald Ford in 1975 that the oil embargo on exports of natural gas was put in place. In 1976, he signed an executive order. That executive order allowed the agencies of the executive branch, at that time it was Commerce, I believe, to allow some exports. Now, on the natural gas side, we were always exporting small amounts of liquefied natural gas from Alaska to Japan. That was just a small 3-inch line that was built next to the Trans-Alaska pipeline system that didn't go all the way to Valdez. It went to Nikiski. And you'd have that small amount of gas, because when you're drilling for oil, what used to be an annoyance of a byproduct was natural gas and distillates. So we did export the natural gas. So think about that for a second. 1975, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975, it started with Ford, Congress put it in place, and we live with that until 2011. 2011, under President Obama, the shale industry was in a boom in the United States. We were pumping more natural gas, distillates, and oil in the United States of America, and on top of that, it happened so quickly that we started building export facilities and changing facilities, like right here in Dominion Cove Point, from an import to a bidirectional facility so that we can import and export. So those applications were going through an executive procedure where the oil and natural gas companies wanted to export that natural gas, because the natural gas prices, quite frankly, were artificially low because you didn't have a completely free market. You could only sell within the United States of America. 2011, who allows it for the exports on that application process? Barack Obama. 2015, Barack Obama is still president. Congress enacts legislation to lift the ban on all oil and natural gas exports from the United States of America. So when you hear now, or I hear now, well, maybe we should do banning on oil and natural gas, I don't believe it's going to work. The price is what the price is on a free market, floated worldwide. And I think it should remain that way. Now, as we look toward where we are now on some of these issues with respect to government policies, I wouldn't necessarily say government policies, but what I would say is what we do in the state of Maryland and what we do in the Port of Baltimore is we aggressively go after infrastructure grant programs. And when we go after those infrastructure grant programs, we have a private sector tied to us, a private sector partner. What does that mean? Well, if you take a look at the CSX grid on the East Coast, CSX, the rail line, right now you can go from New England to Baltimore with double stack containers. In one form or another, you can get it to Baltimore. You can get from Florida to Baltimore with double stack. You cannot go through Baltimore. Baltimore is the pinch point. You can only go single stack train from the Port of Baltimore to Chicago. Chicago is the inland port. That's where everybody tries to get, whether you're on the West Coast or the East Coast, it's Chicago. Ancillary to that would be Columbus, Ohio, and Detroit, Michigan. So we knew it. So what is that pinch point? That pinch point is a tunnel that was built in 1895 on Howard Street in the city of Baltimore. So in the 80s, when double stack was figured out and you could take these ocean containers, put them on top of each other and latch them and yada, 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 Baltimore was out of the game. It's just not economical to run a single stack all up and down the East Coast, or for that matter, consistently from Baltimore into the Midwest. Although we are doing it now with one of our new contractors, but we're preparing for the future. So let me bring it back. So what do? Well, we got together with the private sector, with the state government, with the federal government. And at first, we were looking at cost prohibitive to fix that pinch point at over $2 billion. That's tough, no matter who you're going to, for an infrastructure project. Now, we tied it to this is a national project. This will have benefits for the entire country, but still too expensive. Take another look at it. So we had CSX at the table, let's take another look at it, take another look at it. 4 years later, when you took a look at it, it's no longer $2 billion. We pegged it at $466 million. And that's because of technology. That's because of what you can use by way of track lowering and tunnel notching. So the machinery and probably the rare earth metals that you use to notch that tunnel, that granite tunnel, brought the price down to $466 million. So we applied for an infra grant, Department of Transportation. Got $125 million from the federal government. The governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, he put up $200 million. So there you are right there. $325 million coming from the government. Then you had the state of Pennsylvania. The state of Pennsylvania's in the game. They put in $25 million because in order to fix that bottleneck between Baltimore and Philadelphia, it's actually 22 bridges that need some sort of reconfiguration, whether it's track lowering or construction. So CSX said, okay, we'll put in $113 million. As a private sector partner, to believe in the project, to go forward, you just can't make a market. You have to have the buy-in of not only the government, but the private sector. So they agreed to that. We got the grant. We broke ground in December of 2021. Now, we think that this will open up a lot of options. We do have a couple of carriers that are actually now in the Ohio Valley, and we've got some ships coming in now that are taking it on the single stack into Chicago, but I think that's more a relation of reliability over price, okay? They'll take the reliability from Baltimore to Chicago at an elevated price instead of waiting for another port to get to Chicago. We think that, building that base, it's there, it's working. Nobody's forcing that, but we'll see that with the Howard Street Tunnel opening, we think first, second quarter of 2025. It's gonna take a while to do that. On another one, we call it long-term contracts with your private sector partners. You gotta do long-term contracts. as a port administration, we have on our container side a 50-year contract with Ports America Chesapeake. They are our container operator. So they operate the container port down at Seagirt Marine Terminal. When we go for grants in the federal government, again, we'll go for a grant in the federal government, and I don't know what the term is. We're not pigs when we go there. We actually look at it and say, okay, although the law says you can apply for up to 75% funding for your project from the federal government, well, then go ahead and put that application in, and then I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge, because it doesn't work. You need to have the state, your private sector partner, and when you start approaching 50% asking for the feds, you might be in trouble. So we study, we look at it, and we have a great partner in Ports America Chesapeake that will put the money in order for us to get grants. And then even if we're not getting grants, if you take a look out there, you'll see white cranes. The white cranes that you're looking at, those are $25 million a piece. Guess where they're built? China. It's the only people who can build them. And we had them come in September. So trade with China is essential. No matter what anyone says. It is that way. It has been that way for a while. It's going to continue. Now, we'll see manufacturing bases opening up in Vietnam. All right, if you take a look at your shoes and things of that nature, you're starting to see manufacturing plants being opened up in Vietnam, and we never had any problems with Vietnam, did we? Right? No, never. Oh, they're the best thing going right now. Vietnam, bringing in from Vietnam. We've got India. So there are places that in the trade, but China remains strong. Now, a little bit on the what was said earlier. The Port of Baltimore is the largest importer and exporter of automobiles and high and heavy, that's your machinery, farm machinery, in the United States of America by a good amount. So on the automobile side, what we're gifted with here in the Port of Baltimore is that private sector investment from Mercedes-Benz, Volvo, Volkswagen, and then we have another one, and they're called vehicle processing centers. So anybody know what a vehicle processing center is? All right, so cars come into the United States, they're naked, right? All of the bells and whistles, whether it's a new dashboard, new seats, you want to change something out, sometimes the engines, all of your windshield wipers, spoilers, tires, you want to change it, that's done in the Port of Baltimore. These OEMs build these shops in and around the Port of Baltimore as the processing center before it gets to the dealership. That's where you get everything. That's why you see the efficiency right now. If you bought a car, and maybe not exactly right now, but you were able to go online and change the features of your car while it was on the ship, because it was coming over here without those additions on, those add-ins on. Which brings me to the chip shortage, the microchip shortage. So we have contracts. So on our automobile side, we'll do long-term contracts with ocean carriers and processors, 20 years, 30 years. Wallenius Wilhelmsen, that's a big one of our companies that comes in here. And then they have contracts with some of the OEMs. So the question came up. And I had my staff, and we had Jaguar Land Rover in the room. They were negotiating contracts with VPCs, vehicle processing centers. The question came up. In a Land Rover, anyone know how many microchips are in a Land Rover? And, there's always some smart people around the table that really don't know the answer, but they're going to say it. 100. A dozen. I didn't say anything because I'm smarter than that. I do have a law degree, so don't answer a question you don't know the answer. Don't answer it. Don't. 8,000. 8,000 microchips in a Land Rover. So there were a couple of things that went on with the microchips, and I agree with Steve on the components that go into a microchip and where those rare earth metals and the neon come from. I get that. But you had during the time, during COVID, remember this is before what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, they're water dependent. You had a drought, you had a fire, they were in Taiwan, it was in Korea. I mean, where these things were being made contributed to the fact that, number one, the autos shut down and said we're not manufacturing anymore. There were contracts in place with the microchip makers. The microchip makers like, what the heck's going on here? What do you mean you're not going to build any more cars? Well, everybody pulls their phone out. Well, we still need microchips. We're going to flip the market and we're going to go over here and we're going to start working on the stuff that everybody needs for the office to work at home. And it's more profitable to make those type of microchips as opposed to the legacy microchips that go in automobiles. So you had droughts, you had shortages, you had the pandemic, then you had a snapback. The automobiles came back, roaring back, and now we have a shortage on automobiles. Look at your dealerships because of microchips. So there was government or companies that step forward and say, okay, we'll build an assembly plant in Texas, we'll build one in Ohio. We'll see how that goes. You're still going to need the products that go into those microchips. Two other points I want to make that are local here. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, that was just passed. Now, I was involved in that. I am a former U.S. Federal Maritime Commissioner, so I understand the Shipping Act. And one of the things that was brought to my attention, and I had folks from the World Shipping Council come up to Baltimore, we would sit down, we'd go through it, is that there was an attack on what's known as ocean carrier alliances. Okay, your ocean carrier alliances. Basically, they're called vessel sharing agreements, where an ocean carrier goes to a certain port that another ocean carrier does not go to. This is at its basic terms. But they have common shippers. And in the maritime industry, shippers aren't the ocean carriers. Shippers are your retailers, okay? So if I'm Maersk and I'm going to a port and MSC has a customer that he's negotiated the rate for, meaning MSC, but they don't have a ship to put it on, it's their rate and they put it on a Maersk ship. That's what it is. It is totally secluded off. And when it comes down to the basic fact, there is not one single ocean carrier that can cover the entire world. It doesn't exist anymore. So you need these vessel sharing agreements, these what I would call alliances. Now, the alliances may change from time to time, different companies. So that was what I brought to the table when this discussion came is don't do that. Do not eliminate the antitrust immunity for ocean carriers. It's not going to work. You're going to create a bigger disaster than you could ever imagine because the world is too big now. There are consumers everywhere. We're the largest consumer, but you need these ocean carrier alliances. That was left out of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. They touched around the edges on detention and demurrage, but I could sit here for another hour to talk about that one and then exports, and I'm not gonna. On your labor side, we see labor everywhere, all right? One of the things that goes unnoticed is that, and Steve knows this, is that when you come into Los Angeles, Long Beach, meaning an ocean carrier comes into Los Angeles, Long Beach, you drop the cargo in the port. I equate it to basically the ship's coming up and you're dumping all the cargo into a sink. And you put it into that sink, and then there's a drain line. And that drain line goes 60 miles out into a place called the Inland Empire. The Inland Empire is about 75% the size of the entire New England. And what is the Inland Empire? It's a distribution and warehousing center, Mecca. That's what's there. It's the largest, probably one of the largest distribution centers in the world. But everything goes in there. Containers come off the ship. You try and get them in. You get the truckers. You put the container on the chassis. The trucker takes it out, or rail, get it into the Inland Empire, fill up the warehouse, which didn't take long. And then you can't get it out of the warehouse because there's no workers. Then you end up with shipping containers on a chassis in the parking lot in front of a full warehouse. And you can't get those goods going out. It's all demand. So then you saw shifting in trade patterns. I mean, for Baltimore, we saw probably, up to now, over 60 diverted vessels to the Port of Baltimore that were ordinarily scheduled to go somewhere else. We've seen that over the years. We've also seen, Ro-Ros carrying containers up top on the deck. We've seen containerized cargo pulled out of containerized goods because what we did is we marketed it in such a way, if it has wheels and a stop button, put it on a Ro-Ro. And they're putting them on Ro-Ros instead of containers. Because the container shortage, all based on they're not moving. You're not moving, the system isn't moving to the consumer quick enough because of labor issues. It's not a chassis shortage, it's not a container shortage. It's that movement, it's that labor, it's the whole system not working. In closing, I think that Baltimore's done really well. During the pandemic, the longshoremen did a great job. They took it serious from day one on masking up, hand washing, doing the equipment, and that's the International Longshoremen's Union. They did a phenomenal job in the Port of Baltimore. We also were one of the first ports to restart cruising out of the Port of Baltimore. And that was a conscious effort, a lot based on, unfortunately, politics. We knew that the Mid-Atlantic, we knew that it wasn't a political issue in the Mid-Atlantic and the Mid-Atlantic states to get a vaccination shot. All right, we knew where the CDC was moving. We knew that the cruise ship companies, and we worked with the cruise ship companies in our ports, Carnival Cruise Line and Royal Caribbean. We knew that they were willing to do what they needed to do to get their cruise ship up and running. So we approached them with the CDC and said, hey, listen, you're not going to get any problems in here from the state of Maryland if you put in a vaccination requirement. Some states did not do that. And the reason why we could say that is because the education and whatever the process is in the Mid-Atlantic, it wasn't a political issue for people to get vaccinations. More often than not, I heard you being saying not to want to be vaccinated before you walked onto a cruise ship, so it's not a big deal. So that did work, and we got cruise ships up and running. And then we also were able to do, and again, this is Governor Hogan, we approached them and said, look, we've got these ships, whether it's cruise ships, container ships, cargo ships, break bulk coming into the Port of Baltimore. We got private terminals, we have public terminals. And he was able to make available the Johnson & Johnson vaccination for the seamen, the foreign seamen on the ships coming into the Port of Baltimore. And I was there for a couple of these evolutions. And it is amazing. The expressions on their faces, because a lot of your worldwide crew are Filipinos. They come from the Philippines. And to see them get off the ship, get the vaccination, and they all have phones now, and to take the selfies and send them home to their families that I just got vaccinated in the United States of America in the Port of Baltimore. I mean, it was just phenomenal to see that. And we carried that throughout the pandemic to get they're coming in. I mean, everybody here is vaccinated. They were the only ones that weren't. Their countries didn't have that vaccination yet. So, it was a really, for me as a former, merchant mariner and seaman myself, it was easy for me to make that impassioned, hey, let's do this. I think we can do it and see if these guys can do it. So with that, listen, I appreciate the time. Thank you for inviting me. Steve, thank you once again. Steve and I have known each other back before the Maersk Line Limited days, NDTA, a lot of stuff. So very enlightening. So thank you very much once again. Appreciate it.
So we'll go to questions. Can you hear me? Yes. Questions here, first of all. We've had the view from 30,000 feet, and we've had the view from the ground level. And so let's fill in some of the gaps here with questions. Yes, let me...
Are there any negotiations?
Let me give you...
Are there any negotiations with other cruise lines to bring ships into Baltimore besides Carnival and Norwegian?
Yes.
Can you?
No.
Can you explain?
All right, so hold on, let me just. So what happens is in the Port of Baltimore, you know, we've got the cruise ship terminal, we've got 2 bays, okay? So we got to manage the days in and out. Everybody wants Saturdays and Sundays, but you can do the weeklies. So we're working through those issues right now believe me, there's interest right now. It's a profitable market for the cruise ship companies. It's a drive to port. People drive, they don't fly in like Florida. So you got, and when you're sitting there at the cruise ship terminal, you know where everyone's coming from because they're wearing Cleveland Browns, Pittsburgh Steelers, even New England Patriots, Giants. You know where, so they're all coming and driving in, flying their sports colors.
Robbie, Captain Harris, do you have some questions?
Sure, there are several questions here, and I'll begin with one. And Steve Carmel, I think this is a Steve Carmel kind of question. The question is this: what approximate percentage of today's inflation do you think is attributable to supply chain problems?
Wow. Of course, that would be a pretty good guess because I don't think it's that well disaggregated, and you also got to ask yourself what are supply chain problems. But my guess is not a whole lot more than maybe 2% of it, maybe, if that. I don't think much more than that. Now, remember, the supply chain is also a very nebulous thing. So every time costs go up for someone in the supply chain, it matters. The supply chain or participants in it didn't cause that inflation. We're transmitters of it is probably a better way to put it. So how much of it is rooted in the supply chain itself is if we're, like I said, my view, maybe 2%, if that.
Thank you, Steve.
Steve, while you're here, a year ago, you were highly critical of the government for not having a maritime strategy. So bills have been passed. A lot has happened in the last year. Has that changed at all?
No, the short version. There's a lot of talk about maritime strategy, and I know several conversations with Robbie in particular about this. This country does not have a maritime strategy. What we have is a naval strategy. A maritime strategy addresses all aspects of the blue economy, as we put it, which, by the way, that China has. China actually has a true maritime strategy that addresses everything. Naval power is only one component of it. We don't have anything remotely close to that. We don't have anything that addresses the whole thing as a system, which includes, by the way, ports, shipbuilding. It includes all of that stuff and how it all works together to further national security. We fool around with it a little bit at the edges. The recently done tanker security program, which is an abysmal failure, it won't work. You know, that's the kind of stuff we do. We do stuff that doesn't work. So no, we don't have a maritime strategy, and there does not appear to be any appetite for having one. We continue to fool around with naval strategies, and Robbie's the expert on this, but my guess is Navy ships can't fight very well if they run out of bullets and gas.
Robbie, do you have another question?
I will not comment, but I full agreement with Steve. And here's the next question, and this is a Steve Carmel question also. Are any other countries really doing a better job than we are with all of these supply chain issues? Are all countries really fumblers like we are?
Yeah, basically. But that's because, let's not forget, it's a global system, right? We're not in this on our own. We In fact, there's some countries that are worse. I look at a lot of countries have already put in export restrictions, which I think is massively distorting in terms of local economies. So everybody is struggling with the same problems. Labor is a problem everywhere. The transition to energy is a problem everywhere, and no one is really getting that right. So it does ripple around a lot. Incompetence meets incompetence and doesn't breed competence as a result. So.
Thanks. Question here.
Given all the aspects of the past 2 or 3 years, the supply chain problems, the COVID, the Ukraine war, the truckers, the labor unions, given all that, how has the Port of Baltimore fared compared to other American ports, Los Angeles, for example? Have we increased our tonnage and our ship visits or decreased versus the other ports over the past 2 or 3 years?
We've increased in areas, we've stayed the same in some, and of course, there are areas where we went down. I'll give you a perfect example of how the Port of Baltimore has gone up the past 2 years on a product that, we're up 73% just over last year coming into the Port of Baltimore. So we have a contract that we do with a company called Metzaboard. Metzaboard is out of Finland. They're a forest products company. So they and their subsidiaries consolidated all of their forest products for the Mid-Atlantic Northeast into the Port of Baltimore. We did that in 2020 under a contract. Well, guess what? You know what that paperboard is for? Amazon boxes, UPS, and FedEx. That's what comes in here, and it went through the roof. We had to, we had shed space. We had it all coming through here. We have it coming in. So that went way up. Our containers, when you look at the Port of Baltimore, we're a well-diversified port, okay? Meaning that we have every type of cargo coming in here. We're not a one-trick pony. I'll give you another example of something that's changed. Last year, in June, we had the largest single ship export volume on a single ship of coal ever in the Port of Baltimore. Coal. So we're a huge coal port, export port. It comes from West Pittsburgh, West Virginia. We got rail lines that come in to the Port of Baltimore carrying that. On our container side, what you've seen in the Port of Baltimore is that our diversification in the immediate area. There is no shortage of distribution centers that have been built right here in and around the port. I think 6 Amazon distribution centers have been built over the past 7 years. We've got Trade Point Atlantic, Home Depot, Wayfair, furniture, floor and decor coming in. The distribution centers, when you look in and around the Port of Baltimore, which our reach on your retail and consumer goods will go into the Lehigh Valley, almost into New Jersey. It will go to Pittsburgh, and it will go into Virginia. So it's enormous reach. I'll give you another one. The largest Starbucks roaster in the world is 35 miles up the road in York, Pennsylvania. Its second largest distribution center is in York, Pennsylvania. So when Starbucks and Mallorca Coffee or some of those, they couldn't wait for ships or containers or missed calls in South America to Baltimore. So for the first time, you saw retailers go out, the retailer themselves, go out and directly charter their own ships. And you don't need a 5,000 TEU container ship running from South America to Baltimore in order to carry coffee. You need a 500 or a 350 to get that service going. Does it cost more? Absolutely. Sure does. But it's the reliability. There's a reliability issue. So we've seen a lot that's gone on here Of course, you know, we have salt, that's up. Our high and heavy, the machinery, and again, on Ukraine. We have to segregate at the port right now. If you guys take a look at the rail lines that come in here, it's a beautiful thing to see in the morning. Case New Holland, Caterpillar, and John Deere all export from this port, right? Huge, you see them. Whole line of green coming in, John Deere. Two of the larger markets, I'm not going to say the biggest markets, two of the larger markets were Ukraine and Russia. We can't get them into Ukraine because the Black Sea's got mines in them. So you got to segregate that cargo. Can't go into Russia because there's an export ban. Got to segregate that cargo. Our autos are down. We have the space. We're working with the manufacturers of those companies until they can resell on the world market somewhere. But it's affecting it.
One last question, Mark.
Actually, there's a gentleman behind me who has a question.
Yeah, Steve, I certainly understand that strategic and rare metals are, we need them from other geographic areas in the U.S., but I understand that there are some of those types of metals that are in the United States, but it just costs more to dig them up and refine and develop them. Would, or do we need to, now let me put it this way. Would it help if we reduce the environmental requirements or provided government subsidies for those rare metals that are in the United States, that we would not have to depend on Russia?
Actually, one of our biggest dependencies, of course, is China. For a lot of them, it's our biggest dependency is China because it's the only place you can get a lot of this stuff, but Russia too. There is a little bit of it here. We actually had a rare metals plant out in California, Mountain View, I think was its name, out in California, which produced molybdenum and a few other things. Was shut down mostly because it's just horrendously uncompetitive. And then they started looking at starting it back up again, and the last I saw, the Chinese bought it. So it's actually owned by China now. As is, by the way, Smithfield. If you wondering why your pork chops are expensive, that's Chinese too. So would it help? That's an issue for industrial policy. You cannot, once again, you can't address one thing without understanding what it is in terms of a system level outcome you're trying to achieve. At the top of my head, I'm going to say that subsidies are probably not going to work for something like this because the subsidy would have to be so extreme. You're reliant on the government continuing to provide that money for decades to come in order to pay back what's a very long-lived and expensive investment in mining plant. Plus, there are certainly a lot of environmental considerations. It's done in an area where water is in short supply, and water is a big component of making this stuff and mining it. And it creates a lot of, so it comes back to if you want to be good to the planet, there's a trade-off to that. So you have to look at the totality of things, and in my view, the totality of things is probably not going to work.
So one last question here.
Steve, this is a sort of a follow-up from the question that Roy asked you initially, and this is also from one of our virtual attendees. Probably the one biggest takeaway from your meeting with us last year, whenever it was, that the government should have the minimum role possible. Because if government gets involved, they're going to screw it up. You seem to have moderated on that a little bit, and you seem to say, yes, there is a role for government. Do you care to comment on that?
Sure. Okay, so I still believe that in general, the government monkeying around directly in markets and directly with market mechanisms is a mistake and it won't work. That's not a good thing. But it is true that the government does have a role in any market economy, and I probably downplayed it the last time. Setting the environment is a big one. The government is responsible for monetary policy in the country. The government is responsible for trade policy in the country, and two of the very big things that impact both our competitiveness as a country and as a trading nation. So the government does have a role there. The government is responsible for the mechanism by which contracts are enforced. So you think about the things that a democracy requires, and an independent judiciary is one of the critical ones, and that's why we have to be able to depend on contracts. So there are some things that the government has a role in. I would note, I don't know if anybody saw IMD, the the European Business School released its survey of global competitiveness, and the U.S. Came in 10th overall in terms of global competitiveness, which I find remarkably good considering the government efficiency component of it. We came in 27th. So we do have some work to do there.
Well, that's a good note to end on, and we want to come back to you in about a year's time or 2 years' time and see what your estimate is then. So thank you, everybody, also on Zoom land for joining us tonight. And thank our speakers. I thought it was excellent presentations that covered the waterfront and in a sense, covered the world. And I'd like to just mention to you that our next program is going to be around the 20th of July. It'll be a Zoom program. It'll be at noon because our speaker will be speaking from India. The subject is the decline and peril of Indian democracy, a subject which was news to me, but the more I know about it, the more I'm worried. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Bill. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Robbie.